everyone. Welcome to the Red Summer of 1919. Has anyone ever heard of the Red Summer of 1919? No one? Well, let me tell you about it, okay? All right, the Red Summer was called red because it was very bloody. It was very violent. A lot of people were killed. A lot of innocent people lost their lives. And there was blood on the hands of white supremacists who used acts of terrorism against African Americans. And there were many race riots that came as a result. The Red Summer took place in mid-1919 for the most part in more than 30 cities spread across the United States of America. And hundreds of victims, it was reported, were killed, mostly African Americans. And this is coming from the African American eyewitness account, whereas the official state and government tallies show that there were a little over maybe 100 or so who were killed in these riots that took place during this time period. There were 10 major Red Summer riots, and the book by David Krugler, 1919, The Year of Racial Violence, How African Americans Fought Back, it lists 10 cities that are usually the 10, again, major cities that these riots took place. All right, Charleston, South Carolina. Have you guys heard of Charleston? Anybody? Oh, somebody says Robert Smalls. Very good. Yes, that's right. Robert Smalls, as you said, remembered he was a former slave there, and he also commandeered, he took over a Confederate ship and was able to sail it to the Union Army and give it to them as a very, very valuable gift. And what else did you say? That's right. Smalls became a famous congressman there, and he was heavily involved in politics in the state of South Carolina, especially in his hometown of Charleston. Very good, very good. How about Longview, Texas? Anybody heard of Longview? Well, guess what? I have. Longview is where my family is from, and I heard about this terrible riot from my grandfather and from others in my family, and just growing up as a child hearing these stories, it was just so hard to believe. Bisbee, Arizona. Anybody heard of Bisbee? How about Washington, D.C.? Oh, somebody says that's our nation's capital. You are so right. It is. And yes, a major race riot took place in our nation's capital. Now that is really hard to believe also, that in our nation's capital that something like this could have actually taken place that was so violent and so bloody. All right, how about Chicago, Illinois? Oh, somebody says it's the Windy City. You are right, the Windy City of Chicago. But I'll tell you what, during this hot, terribly hot summer of 1919, those winds were not blowing, especially for African Americans. The winds of help weren't there for the most part. All right, so let's go to Knoxville, Tennessee. Anybody heard of Knoxville? How about Omaha, Nebraska? Oh, somebody says Malcolm X was born there. Very good. And if you remember in Malcolm's book, the autobiography of Malcolm X, he talked about the Ku Klux Klan presence in Omaha, and he believes they're the ones who viciously murdered his father. All right, how about Phillips County, Arkansas? Anybody heard of Phillips County? Well, you might not know Phillips County too much because There's really a little city that's in Phillips County called Elaine, like the woman's name. And that's where this riot took place. How about Gary, Indiana? Oh, somebody says the Jackson Five. And the Jackson, yes, Michael Jackson and his brothers, they were from Gary, Indiana. Very good. And yeah, Gary, Indiana, there was a major racial riot that took place there in 1919. How about Bogalusa, Louisiana? Anybody heard of that? Well, guess what? I hadn't really heard too much of Bogalusa either until I learned about the Red Summer riots that took place. All right. At the root of the Red Summer of 1919, you have white mobs that provoked a lot of violence against African Americans during this period. Okay, you had white mobs that would gather together for the purpose of bringing whatever they felt was justice against especially black males who were falsely accused of rape. And these black males would be taken. And as you see, there's two of them here. You can't see their faces, but you can see the bottom parts of their bodies that are obviously hanging from a tree. And you see one gentleman with the white, sort of like a cloth wrapped around him. And you can only imagine some of the horrible acts that were taking place, the violence that occurred against African Americans. You wouldn't believe some of the horrendous things that were done to them. All right, so the reason these white mobs felt so empowered to go after African Americans was because oftentimes they had the support of law enforcement. The local authorities were on their sides, quite often complicit in the lynchings, often turning over inmates from the jail cells to the crowds. Okay, let's continue here. Vigilantism during the Red Summer. You had white paramilitary and patriotic associations that brought forth a lot of violence against African Americans as well. And you had something like you see in this image here, the American Protective League. There were over 250,000 or so members scattered across the country. And you had white veterans, mostly, who were part of this organization. And they also took part in a lot of the violence that occurred against black Americans. So in 1919, African Americans said, hey, we got to do something, man. So they decided, look, we're gonna wage a three-front war, basically to protect ourselves. And also what we want out of this is we want the federal government, we want this country to recognize our constitutional rights that have been denied us ever since basically we've been in this country. Our ancestors through slavery, and then even during the period of Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment that was supposed to work for us never worked like it was supposed to. All right. African Americans, the first front war that took place. Basically, what they wanted and what they did was they mobilized self-defense forces. They realized that was key. If they were going to stop the white mobs who sought violence against them, they needed to defend themselves. So, what did African Americans do to stop or to attempt to stop the white mob violence? Well, they were going after these white mobs because what were they doing? They were driving blacks from the industrial jobs that they were working at, and also the African Americans that were living in white neighborhoods, they were removed from them and violently removed, and quite often there were those who were lynched as well. African Americans were also punished by these white mobs for their wartime prosperity. And what we mean by that is that you had African Americans who came from the South to northern parts of the country, as well as certain parts even going westward, more like Arkansas, Oklahoma type of areas and so forth. And later they're going to come to California. But defense industries, especially during this time period of 1919, the Great War, World War I, had just ended. But during that period that the war was going on, the war preparations, preparing for war, the defense industries, these companies and corporations, they needed workers. And they hired a lot of African Americans. So African Americans were able to earn a decent living. And they were able to prosper in many ways. And a lot of the whites in the areas where these African Americans were, they didn't like seeing successful African Americans, especially that were equal socioeconomically to them, or that even had a greater status. This was a problem. And quite often white mobs would begin to form against these type of African Americans. As well, the white mobs wanted to protect white women from black men. They were always falsely accusing black men of rape and assault, and that would trigger a lot of mob violence. So these are the reasons why black Americans sought to mobilize, to bring forth organization for themselves to protect as well as their families and their communities. All right, the second front of the war for African Americans during the Red Summer, they engaged in this battle for the truth. They wanted to tell the truth about the riots. The mainstream newspapers were always blaming African Americans for starting the riots. So the black press, like here, this image you see, the Chicago Defender, they want to present truth about the riots and what really happened. And the black press, they were all about inspiring and motivating and advocating for black people to defend themselves and to bring forth resistance to mob violence. All right, and the third front of the war, it was all about justice. African Americans were basically prosecuted, those who were self-defenders, defending themselves, while the white people who were involved in the riots, they for the most part always went free. So the white authorities would bring capital murder charges against African Americans who were innocent, and this was a problem. So African Americans were saying, hey, we got to fight for justice and bring a lot of spotlight to these issues so that we can receive the recompense, justice, the fairness that we need. All right, so the key factor to African Americans' resistance to the white mob violence that took place during the Red Summer of 1919. Have any ideas what that might have been? Any ideas? What the key factor to the African American resistance was during this time period? Well, let's go to it. It was all about the black soldiers who returned home from World War I. And when they returned home from World War I in 1918 and 1919, well, first of all, their story when they were in Europe fighting, they refused to surrender there, okay? And they were not treated well by their own American officers and fellow soldiers, the white soldiers. So quite often, these soldiers, they were used by the French. The French told the Americans, if you're not going to use them, let us use them. So they fought alongside the French. The French treated them as equals, treated them very well. And the African American soldiers vowed when they returned home, they were not going to put up with a lot of the racism that they had put up before in the injustices. So they developed a new attitude. They became the new Negro. They weren't the old docile Negro anymore. So this inspired African Americans all over the country, especially in the cities of the riots. The African American soldiers led the way, and they believed the poem by Claude McKay, "If We Must Die," they were willing to die for their people.